Is what most people call a saint actually just a beginner? Hi, I'm Mike Mason. This is St. Joe Society podcast. The St. Joe Society is a Catholic lay apostolate devoted to help men order all things to Christ as they grow strong in mind, body, and spirit. If you'd like to check out more about us, you can see us at stjosephsociety.org. All right, gentlemen, this week, this is episode 34 of the St. Joseph Bootcamp. We've been at this for 9 months now, working our way through the bootcamp, and we are to our final 3 episodes. Now, last week, we discussed the nature of the perfection of the Christian life. So what I shared with you guys is that the goal of the St. Joe Society is to help men order all things to Christ. Their whole life is ordered towards our Lord by growing strong in mind, body, spirit. Most of the substance of our podcast is going to be on what are called the 3 ways of the interior life, or growing in perfection of the Christian life, or what we commonly in the Catholic world just call becoming a saint. To this point in the podcast, we've done a lot of dogmatic theology, which is what the church teaches. That is true, like dogmas of the faith that are found in the creed. And the reason why we started there is we had to build a dogmatic foundation for our reflection about the faith morally and spiritually. For St. Thomas Aquinas, theology is not a subject that can be divided up. Okay, theology is one science. It's a science of knowing God, and then the science of how created things are related to God. And so we have to lay a foundation of dogmatic theology before we look at the moral life, because what the moral and spiritual life is a response to what's true about God and the world and ourselves. Okay. So we don't ever want to think that, like, okay, we did our dogma, we're going to set that aside. Now we're going to take up the morals as if it's a separate thing. But the truths of dogma and the truths of the moral and spiritual life actually work together back and forth. Okay. So we'll be revisiting those themes we talked about in the foundation this year as we progress in the future. But where we're turning this month is the attention of really the primary focus of this podcast and of this apostolate. And that is helping men grow in their faith and become the godly, Christ-like leaders that God intends them to be. And what we're going to primarily study is what's called the 3 ways of the interior life, okay, in Catholic moral spirituality. So last week, before we jumped into the 3 ways, we talked about the nature of Christian perfection, that God calls us to this perfection. We have a duty to perfection. And then we talked about kind of what the nature of it is. This week, we're going to look at what's called the first way of the interior life, which is the Purgative Way. Next week, we'll look at the second way, which is the Illuminative Way. And then the third, we're going to look at what's called the Unitive Way, which is kind of full saintliness. The 3 ways of the interior life is actually a progression in holiness that people go through. So in the spiritual tradition, and in a minute, I'll look at where this is found even in the scriptures, there's 3 phases of interior life, and there's 3 conversions. So you have an initial conversion, which leads to the first way of the interior life. Then there's a second conversion, which ushers us in from the Purgative Way to the Illuminative Way, which is the second way. And then there's a third conversion that then heightens us up into the Unitive Way. And so when you study spiritual theology, is you look at the hallmarks of these 3 ways and the advice to how to progress through them, how to recognize the crises or conversions that move us on to the next one, and then how to navigate those well. Okay. And so what we're going to start this week is what's called the Purgative Way, which is the way of beginners. Now, I opened the podcast with a little question: is what most people call a saint a beginner? As we take it kind of like a 30,000 foot view of the Purgative Way, I think one of the things you guys are going to realize is that what a lot of people call a saint is merely just a beginner. Now, that might be intimidating for you or might be exciting, because I can totally understand both. It should be exciting because when you see that we can enter into the Purgative Way, when God gets us there, he has a lot more planned for our relationship with him and then our growth in virtue. Okay. And so it should excite us that God has this plan of progress and he's willing to supply the graces we need to navigate it. What we're going to do in this podcast and then in our monthly meetings with your parish priest is your parish priest is going to give you spiritual direction to help you start navigating these 3 ways. The podcast is going to supply you with that knowledge you need to understand the base principles at work in each one. And then through that spiritual direction, you guys are going to start growing like crazy, which is going to be super exciting. But what we're going to do in this podcast, we're going to take that 30,000 foot view of the Purgative Way. We're going to discuss the nature and purpose of the Purgative Way, the 3 categories of beginners. So if you're in the Purgative Way and you're a beginner, we're going to look at, you're going to fit in one of 3 categories. And then we're going to look at the first and most important task of the Purgative Way. But before we jump into that, let's look and make sure that these 3 ways of interior life are found in the scriptures, and they are. In the Old Testament, Psalm chapter 34, verse 14, it says this: depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. The phrase depart from evil is the Purgative Way. The admonition to do good is the Illuminative Way. And to seek peace and pursue it would be the Unitive Way. In the New Testament, in Luke chapter 9, verse 23, Jesus says this: if any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. The let him deny himself is the reference to the Purgative Way. Taking up your cross daily is the Illuminative Way. And follow me would be the Unitive. So we see here in the Old and New Testament, in the Psalms, and right here in Luke chapter 9, we see the three aspects of material of the spiritual life right in these passages. The church fathers, and over the last few centuries, the church has kind of put together a theology of the spiritual life that we're going to explore in this podcast. But for today, we're going to limit ourselves to the Purgative Way. All right, what is the Purgative Way? The Purgative Way is the stage of the spiritual life where the soul is purified of past faults and strengthened against future faults. So purified of the past, strengthened to the future. St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27 says this: do you not know that in a race all runners compete, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Well, I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I pummel my body and subdue it, lest after preaching to others, I myself would be disqualified. In this passage, we see a description of the Purgative Way. You see here in St. Paul, he compares the spiritual life to the athletic life. One insight I've always appreciated because I'm a big sports guy. And he talks about the fact that think of what athletes will do. They'll pummel their bodies. They'll train their bodies. They'll go through all kinds of sacrifice to get a prize, a trophy that they have to leave here. Okay, that's going to waste away. How much more so than we, when it comes to our spiritual life, should be training ourselves in righteousness in order to receive a crown that we can never lose. So in this podcast, in this apostolate, we're looking at how to enter into training to become strong in mind, body, spirit, not for perishable goals, but for eternal ones. Okay, so we're taking St. Paul's advice here and we're training ourselves in righteousness and we're competing for an everlasting crown. Now, when we say the Purgative Way is for beginners, what is a beginner in the spiritual life? Who are called beginners? In Adolf Tanquery's book, which we're going to reference a lot in this podcast, it's a fantastic book on the spiritual life. He says this: in the spiritual life, beginners are those that habitually live in the state of grace and have a certain desire for perfection, but who have still attachments to venial sin and are exposed to fall now and then into grievous faults. Okay, so notice what a beginner is according to Tanquery. Beginners are people who are habitually in a state of grace. Okay, this isn't a person that spends most of their time in a state of mortal sin. Okay, so if you have a baptized Catholic, maybe confirmed, the whole deal, who's in a state of mortal sin, he's not a beginner in the spiritual life. And a beginner in the spiritual life, you have to have at least some desire for perfection. The fact you guys listen to this podcast and go to St. Josetti shows that you have to have some desire for perfection. You wouldn't put this effort in. Okay. But notice a person in beginning phase still has attachments to venial sin. And from time to time, not habitually, but from time to time, they're going to fall into grievous faults, okay, of grave mortal sins. So Tanquery goes on further. He says, we therefore rule out of the class of beginners those that frequently commit mortal sin and do not avoid its occasions. They are sinners, worldlings, who must first of all be helped to sever their attachment to mortal sin and part with the occasions of sin. So notice a beginner is not a person that's in and out of mortal sin all the time. They're not a person that puts themselves in situations and occasions to commit mortal sin. That's not a beginner. A beginner is someone who's really severed a lot of their attachments to mortal sin. They may fall into it from time to time, but they've really severed a lot. They're keeping themselves outside of those situations, and they do have a desire for perfection that they're starting to follow. Okay, so those are our beginners. Now, beginners can fall into three basic categories. Remember, beginners aren't necessarily by age. Okay, a beginner could be a 15-year-old or a 45-year-old. But different categories of beginners include three types. First are innocent souls. These are people that are just that. They're innocent. They're young men and women who've taken their faith seriously. They're fulfilling what the Purgative Way asks for, but they are beginners in the spiritual life. So these would be very young people, maybe teenagers, middle schoolers, things like that, who are innocent, but they're also just beginners. They have not started to move up through the phases of the interior life, but they're at a good start. The second class are what are called converts. Now, I would fit into this one. Convert's a person who sinned grievously in the past, but they've returned to God with sincerity, and they're pressing on towards perfection. And so I'm sure some of you are converts, or and a convert doesn't mean a person who became Catholic. It just could be a person who starts taking their faith more seriously. But a convert's a person who has sinned, but is turning things around. The third category is lukewarm souls. Lukewarm souls are people who've given themselves to God. They've made some progress in the spiritual life, but they've fallen into a state of tepidity. Okay. So these people are not really on fire anymore. They're not committing mortal sin, but they're not progressing. They're just kind of lukewarm and staying there. Okay. All beginners are going to fit in one of these three levels. Okay. And it's a good exercise for each one of us to consider where we may be in the three. Now, once we have an idea of, okay, if we're in the Purgative Way, we've entered it. If we have an idea of what category of beginner we are, the first task of the beginner is to purify the soul. Okay. Perfection, guys, consists essentially in union with God through love. So loving God is what perfection is. We talked about this last week. Perfection isn't flawlessness. It's completing the end which God made for us. So God made us to be in loving union with him. As we do that, as our relationship with him grows and our love of him grows in our hearts, we are becoming perfect, which will be completed in the next life. Okay. In order to do this, we have to atone from past sins, and we need to detach ourselves from those sins and avoid sin in the future. So for our love to grow, we have to get rid of the sin of the past and atone for it, detach from it, break apart from it, and then set our lives up so that we avoid it in the future. Because at this phase, guys, we love God and we don't want anything getting in the way. Okay. So this purification of the soul happens through through our contrition, being contrite over our sins, doing penance and mortification, okay, which we're going to talk about those more in depth in the future. But our purification, okay, can be motivated by two basic things. One is fear of punishment. That's called imperfect. Or it can flow from the fact that we love God and want to please him. So when you get in the Purgative Way, a lot of times guys will start into the Purgative Way because say they don't want to go to hell. That's where I started. Very imperfect motivation. Good motivation. I mean, it got me in, but imperfect. As you grow in love of God through the Purgative Way, your motivation will change from I'm trying to avoid punishment to I want to have friendship with God. Okay. What we're going to talk about in the Purgative Way, guys, is we're going to discuss how you enter into it in future podcasts. We're going to talk about how you enter into it. We're going to talk about the different aspects of the spiritual life as you progress through it, and then how to recognize when the next conversion, the second conversion, a next crises, God's going to introduce in your life to move you on into what's called the Illuminative Way, which we'll talk about next week. And so I want to challenge you guys as we're going in this last month of podcasts together and meetings. I want to challenge you guys to stay with us. Okay, join the St. Joe Society. Come back and meet in July, in June, so that we can start growing in our faith together. In future podcasts, we're going to talk about what your prayer life should look like at the Purgative Way. We're going to talk about what penance is and how to do it. That's atoning for past sins. We're going to talk about mortification, which is how we safeguard our future by detaching ourselves from sin and things of this world that keep us from loving God more. And then we're going to talk about how do you do warfare against the deadly sins? How do we keep in temptation and those sort of things? A lot of our podcast, guys, is going to be theological. So I want to teach you guys some really cool moral and spiritual theology. A lot of it's going to be really practical too. Practical tips on how to make progress. So this month, the challenge is join the St. Joe Society. Stick with us, fellas. We got a great future coming. Second, be praying that Memorare to St. Joseph. Try to incorporate it sometime during the day to mix in some daily prayer. And remember, we're praying that for the intent of the society. And the intent of society is that the men who are involved in the society would become the godly leaders and Christ-like men that God wants them to be. So we'll end there. Next week, we're going to turn our attention to the Illuminative Way and look at the second phase of the spiritual life. Hope you guys have a blessed week. I'll see you next time.